What would you do if the thing you feared most showed up on your doorstep, begging for help? One late autumn night, deep in the misty forests of North Carolina, a reclusive man named Royce Tanner heard a knock on his cabin door. When he opened it, he didn't find a hunter. He didn't find a monster. He found Bigfoot, soaked in rain, eyes glowing amber, hands clasped, as if begging. It wasn't rage in those eyes. It was desperation, a silent plea. Royce followed the creature into the woods and found another one, a female, trapped in a steel snare, foaming at the mouth, dying. And beside her, that towering beast knelt, gently touching her brow, silently asking for help. So Royce did what most wouldn't. He called on Iris Bell, a widowed veterinary nurse he once saved in a snowstorm. That night, they returned to the woods, not to hunt, but to heal. And as Iris reached to inject a crude antidote, the beast steadied her trembling hand with his own. No growl, no fear, just trust. But humans weren't finished. A group of poachers, led by a ruthless trafficker, was closing in. Bullets echoed through the trees. And Bigfoot, he didn't run. He stepped into the gunfire to shield the very humans who helped him. This is not a tale of monsters. It's a testimony of connection, across species, across fear, across silence. Because sometimes the sacred doesn't live in churches. It lives in the eyes of those we once feared. So tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? And how far do you think this story of trust and quiet courage can reach? From the heart of the forest, our deepest thanks to you, dear listener. It was the last night of fall in the Appalachians, and the wind carried that heavy smell of wet oak and rotting bark, like the land itself was trying to hold its breath one last time before winter pressed down. Inside the old cabin tucked near the red clay stream, Royce Tanner poured the last of his coffee into a cracked enamel mug. 52 and widowed 15 winters past, he lived quiet now, surrounded by creaking floorboards and the low hum of a wood-burning stove that sometimes made more conversation than the folks down in Maple Hollow. He was used to the kind of silence that came with solitude. A good silence, the kind you learn to trust. The dog had been gone a few years, his daughter too, and most mornings, he liked it better that way. Just him, the smell of pine smoke clinging to the rafters, and the old tin pot whistling when it got too hot. But something about that night felt off, like the hush in the forest had grown too still, the way it gets right before a branch snaps under the weight of something watching. Then came the sound. Heavy, not like a deer, no shuffle of hooves, no frantic claws scratching bark. Just wait, one step, then stillness. Another, then a breath. Royce froze, his fingers tightening around the mug. He turned the stove knob down to a low ember, reached for the old flashlight out of habit, then hesitated. Something was at the door. Not knocking, just waiting. When he opened it, the fog rushed in first, thin and cold, like a ghost slipping between seams. Behind it stood a shape no man expects to see in his lifetime, much less on a Tuesday night in the dead hush of November. Nearly 9 feet tall, soaked through with mist and rain, a massive figure filled the space just beyond the porch light. It wasn't snarling, wasn't wild-eyed, just there, still, drenched. Shoulders slumped, hands trembling slightly from exhaustion or cold, or something older. Firelight from inside caught the stranger's face, and Royce's breath hitched in his throat. It was a face, but not an animal's. A man's face twisted in something old and wild, human-like wild man face. Eyes the color of dark amber, holding that strange, intelligent sorrow only those who've lost too much ever seem to carry. Beneath thin layers of wet facial fur, patches of human skin showed in flashes, wind-burned, darkened, real. A short beard clung to its chin like moss on a river rock. It didn't speak, didn't groan, just slowly brought both hands to its chest, palms together in front of the heart, and dipped its head once. A gesture that wasn't beast. It was asking. Then it stepped backward into the fog, looked over its shoulder, and vanished into the woods with a glance that said, "Follow." Royce didn't think. He grabbed his old canvas bag from the coat hook by the door, the same one he used when dogs stepped on rusted nails or neighbors found owls tangled in wire. Slipped on his coat, turned out the cabin lights, latched the door behind him like it was just another errand, like he wasn't following a legend into the dark belly of a mountain. The footprints it left in the leaf-choked mud were wide and deep. 5 toes, no claws. Real. So he followed, his boots squelching in silence, hands gripping the flashlight but never turning it on. Didn't need to. The shape stayed just ahead. Enough to guide, not enough to warn. The trail twisted through stands of white pine and skeletal oaks, their wet branches arching overhead like arms that remembered better seasons. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. Royce's breath fogged and vanished, and mist clung to his beard, his coat, his lashes. The forest here didn't feel like land anymore. It felt like memory, buried thick and breathing. The trees closed in, then opened suddenly to a hollow so quiet it might have been waiting. There, in a shallow basin rimmed by rock and brush, lay another figure. Smaller, though still massive. A female Bigfoot, though that word didn't fit the weight of what he saw. She was sprawled on her side, one leg twisted unnaturally, caught in the steel maw of a rusted trap. Royce knew the kind, not made for catching but for holding down whatever screamed. Her fur, soaked and mottled with leaves, shuddered with every thin breath. Foam curled at the corners of her mouth, tinged with green. Poison, maybe, or pain. The kind that hums under skin like bees trapped in a jar. Her face, a mirror of the male's but softer, twitched with each breath, eyes barely open, showing only the whites beneath swollen lids. Royce's throat dried. Not with fear, with recognition. He knew this wasn't an ambush. This was a plea. The male knelt beside her, one massive hand resting on her brow, brushing hair or fur or something in between, away from her face. Royce stepped forward slowly, unzipping his bag, voice low but steady like the one he used when calming frightened horses or cornered foxes. He crouched, placing the bag gently on the damp earth, glancing once at the male, who didn't move, didn't challenge, just watched. Royce read the silence like a language. He checked the trap first. Industrial grade, old metal, stained with rust and something darker. It had sliced clean into the ankle joint. Not bone, not yet, but bad. Then the foam. He sniffed near her mouth, caught a sharp tang. Not blood, toxin, bait laced with pesticide, maybe. He'd seen it used before by old trappers, the kind who'd rather kill than risk the target fighting back. This one wasn't meant to hold. It was meant to silence. His hands moved fast but careful, slicing the mud away from the trap's base with his pocket knife. He folded his coat into a makeshift pad to wedge beneath the hinge. The female stirred once, a tremor that made Royce flinch. He steadied her head, felt the heat pouring from her skin like fever. The male crouched closer, silent but alert, ready to move if Royce did wrong. "Easy now," Royce whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He didn't know what they understood, but somehow, the forest itself felt like it was holding its breath to listen. The release came with a snap. Metal loosened. Not enough to free her completely, but enough to stop the slow cutting. She moaned then, barely more than a vibration, and the male made a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, not a whimper. Something like grief. Royce knelt back, hands coated in mud and blood, heart beating too loud. The trap was still biting, but now he could work. He needed antitoxins. Something fast, something from a vet's stash. And he couldn't do it alone. There was someone. Iris. She lived just over the ridge, in the old house with the blue door and the hummingbird wind chimes. Iris Bell, 34, sharp with a needle, steady with a wound. Lost her husband in a flash flood last year on Route 19. Moved in with her mother after. Didn't talk much anymore, but she still knew the difference between mercy and delay. Royce stood, turned to the male, pointed toward the ridge, then tapped his chest once. Stay. The male didn't nod, didn't react, but didn't follow either. Royce backtracked fast, taking a shortcut through the cedar cut, breathing hard, mud climbing his boots, flashlight off. He reached the signal mound, the old Cherokee burial rise folks barely noticed now, and lit a torch of pine resin and dry grass, then jammed it into the earth. Let the smoke climb. Let it say what words never could. Help. When he knocked on Iris's back door, she opened it already dressed, as if something had told her before the smoke. She saw his face. Didn't ask. They moved quick. No fanfare. Just medicine, gauze, syringes. And silence. Royce led. Iris followed. The mist had thickened, curling between trunks like threads trying to sew the forest shut again. When they returned to the hollow, the scene hadn't changed. The female was still breathing, barely. The male looked up just once, amber eyes glassy, damp from fog, or something older. He moved aside. Iris didn't speak. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She knelt, felt for a pulse, winced. Poison still had its hooks in her. "She's fading," she whispered. Royce didn't answer, just handed her the needle. As Iris prepared the injection, Royce adjusted the trap, twisting his body to give her space. The female jolted once as the needle sank in, but didn't cry out. Her breathing slowed, deeper. Her fingers, massive, gnarled, furred but familiar, twitched near Royce's boot. He didn't step back. Then came the sound. Just faint. A snap. Up the ridge. A twig breaking. Not animal, not wind. The kind of snap made by a man who doesn't want to be heard. Royce turned slowly. Iris froze. The male did not move, but his gaze lifted toward the ridge. No words, just silence, coiled tight. The feeling returned. That electric hush. The kind that tells you you're not alone, that something's watching, something that doesn't believe in saving. They didn't run, didn't speak, just moved together, slow, careful, urgent. The work wasn't done, but something else had begun, and the forest, older than all of them, simply kept breathing. The steel jaw trap still clung to her ankle like some cruel invention dug up from a time when people feared the woods more than they feared God. Royce crouched low again, pressing 2 fingers just beneath the ridge of fur where muscle gave way to bone. The Bigfoot female's breathing came slow, shallow, barely there. He could feel the heat radiating through her thick hide, and underneath it, a faint tremor that spoke of poison moving fast through the bloodstream. Not just blood loss, something sharper, colder. He reached for his flask, not to drink, but to clean the knife, just in case the swelling got worse. Her skin was warm to the touch, but slick with sweat or rain, or both. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Only the soft lift of her chest told him she was still here. He pulled back, wiped his hands on the inside of his coat, and glanced toward the male, still watching, still kneeling beside her like some ancient sentinel carved from soaked earth and shadow. That same human-like wild man face stared straight through Royce, as if measuring not the man's strength, but his soul. Royce didn't speak. There was no use in words. Only actions counted now. The way a man knelt, the way his hands worked, the way he looked at another living being and chose compassion over fear. He knew he couldn't stop the poison with what he had on him. The trap had bitten deep and dirty. Whatever bait it held, Chemical, venom, Royce didn't know. Had laced her blood with something no field herb or whiskey burn could fix. She needed something stronger, something fast, something that lived in a drawer, inside a cabinet, inside a house lit by kerosene and memory. And he knew exactly where that house was. Iris Bell hadn't been seen much since the accident, since the truck that took her husband spun out on 27 during the April flood and folded itself into the guardrail like paper. She'd come back to Maple Hollow after, moved in with her mother, who spent most of her days knitting or staring at the window with blank eyes. Iris worked less, spoke softer, and kept to herself. But everyone still remembered the way she'd handled the pit bull attack that winter, or the coyote with a broken spine. If there was anyone who still had the hands and the guts to help this creature, it was her. Royce stood, spine creaking, knees stiff, and looked around. They couldn't wait for daylight, couldn't risk staying longer than they had to. He needed her now. No phone, no radio. Not that she'd answer either. But there was one way folks used when things needed saying without words. He turned east, eyes scanning for the old signal rise. Just past the trampled patch of ferns, above a small rock outcrop, sat a low mound of dirt layered with pine needles and covered in half-rotted branches. Cherokee used to call it the Whisper Hill. Folks in Maple Hollow just called it the Ridge. He climbed it, careful not to stumble, heart knocking in his chest, not from fear, but urgency. From his coat pocket, he pulled the bundle of dry kindling he always kept on him, just in case. Wrapped in twine and cedar bark. He opened it fast, added a touch of pine sap from a glass vial in his other coat pocket, and struck the match. The flame hissed, caught, crawled. He held it low, near the edge, until it licked at the sap and flared. He set it upright in the dirt, watching as it belched a trail of black smoke into the foggy dark. It wasn't loud. It didn't shine bright, but it rose steady. Smelled of memory, of blood, of help. Royce turned and ran. Maple Hollow curved down the mountain like a tired sigh. The path twisted through muddy switchbacks and over a rusted fence line, the same one he'd climbed 100 times as a boy. The air smelled of rotting leaves and old apples. When he reached the Bell place, he didn't knock, just stood at the back door under the dim porch lamp, rain patting his shoulders like it was asking him to reconsider. The door opened before his fist even touched wood. Iris stood there in a wool sweater too big for her frame, eyes already wide and scanning his face like she'd seen the smoke and been waiting. She didn't ask questions, just turned and moved inside, the smell of antiseptic and cedar soap clinging to the air. He followed. She reached for the canvas duffel without a word, unzipped it, checked for syringes, gauze, 2 vials, one pale blue, one amber. She hesitated a second, then added both. Her hands didn't shake. Neither did his. They moved together out the back, into the dark. By the time they returned to the hollow, the fog had thickened into something denser than cloud, but lighter than water, as if the forest didn't want them found. The male Bigfoot hadn't moved, still by her side, one hand cupping the back of her head, the other resting over the wound, trying, uselessly, to shield her from the world. Iris stopped 5 feet away, dropped to her knees, and unzipped the duffel. Her eyes met Royce's for the first time. "Tell me," she whispered. "Steel trap, bit through tendon. She's poisoned. I think the bait had toxin," he said low, almost ashamed. She nodded, opened the amber vial, drew the liquid into the syringe. Her hand still didn't shake. The male watched every motion, his human-like wild man face caught in the glow of Royce's dim lamp, a face worn from storm and fire, sorrowful yet focused. His amber eyes didn't blink as Iris moved closer, crouched beside the female, pressed fingers to her thigh to locate the femoral vein. She cleaned the area quickly, then lifted the syringe. Royce moved to hold the female steady, but didn't need to. She flinched slightly, but didn't resist. The needle slid in, a faint twitch, then stillness again. Iris exhaled, sat back on her heels. First dose. If she survives the hour, we give her the second, she murmured. Royce reached for gauze, started cleaning around the trap. The metal still clung tight, but he knew forcing it now could cause more damage. He reached for the knife again, tried to slide fabric between the wound and metal. The female stirred. Iris looked up, watching. The moment stretched, and then the male did something Royce never expected. He leaned forward, slow and cautious, and extended one massive hand. His fingers moved gently, carefully, and touched Iris's wrist. Not to stop her, not to harm, just to steady. Her eyes jumped to his. She didn't move. His touch was impossibly light. A brush, a whisper, but it was enough. Her fingers stopped trembling. Her breath evened. Royce saw it too. That brief flicker in Iris's face. Shock, then calm. Like a current had passed between them. Like something old and quiet had said, "I trust you." The fog pulsed around them, and then came the sound again, faint. A dry crack, not from them. Up the ridge, somewhere off trail, too deliberate for a falling branch, too quiet for thunder. Royce froze. Iris did too. They weren't alone. Royce turned off the lamp. Darkness rushed in like a tide. Only the faint glow of moss on stone gave shape to the world. The male stood. His form rose from crouching to towering, blocking both Royce and Iris from the sound's direction. His shoulders squared, his head tilted slightly. His whole body, every line of fur and flesh, tensed, not with fear, with readiness. Royce touched Iris's shoulder, whispered, "We're being watched." She didn't nod, just pressed her hand to the Bigfoot female's chest, feeling the rhythm there, counting seconds between each breath. And somewhere beyond the mist, between the trees, something exhaled. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind. It was something human, something that didn't belong here. But it was watching, waiting, and the woods held its breath again. The fog had thickened to the point it no longer hung in the trees. It sat in them, pooled in the low brush like breath held too long. Royce steadied his back against the slope, fingers clenched around the handles of the old bolt cutters, their rubber grips worn soft with time. Somewhere to the east, beyond the edge of the hollow, that sound again, soft but wrong, snapped another twig. It didn't echo. It sank like weight into wet earth. Not a fox, not deer. Something else. Royce didn't need to see it to know. He'd been hunted before. The woods had a way of telling you when it was no longer yours. Below, under the low bend of cedar limbs slick with rain, the female Bigfoot's breathing faltered again. Iris leaned in, one palm flat on the furred chest, counting out the seconds. 6, 7, too long between. The first dose was working, slowing the toxin, but not enough. Her jaw clenched as she reached for the gauze, cut another strip with shaking hands. Not from fear, from the weight of getting it right. Royce moved fast now, dropping to his knees in the mud beside the trap. He wrapped a wool scarf around his palms, wedged the padded cutters against the hinge, and leaned in with a grunt. The old metal groaned, but didn't give. He repositioned. Again. The trap snapped half open this time, just enough to ease pressure off the flesh. Blood welled slowly, not fast enough to panic, but steady. He pressed the scarf into place, gave Iris room. Her breath came quick. She reached again for the second syringe, hands brushing the fur gently, searching for the vein through the thick coat and muscle. The female stirred, a low moan in her chest that sounded too much like a woman in pain for Iris to ignore. Then a pause. The male shifted, just slightly. Iris kept her eyes low, but her hand wavered midair. Not from hesitation, from the sudden ache in her wrist, like all her energy had drained through her fingertips and left them numb. Royce moved to reach over, but stopped when he saw the shadow stretch beside her. The male Bigfoot extended his arm slowly, deliberately, palm upward. His fingers curled inward, and then he did something neither Royce nor Iris expected. With a gentleness impossible for something his size, he laid his hand over Iris's wrist. Just that. A light, careful pressure. She froze, not because she feared harm, but because something in that touch steadied her better than any breath could. Her pulse evened out. Her hand stopped trembling, and when she finally looked up, she saw it. His face, human-like and drenched from the fog. His eyes not fierce, but quietly resolute. Those amber eyes held a kind of trust that didn't need words. She nodded. Just once. Royce blinked, like trying to catch up with the world around him. But something about that moment had changed the air in the hollow. Less fear, more knowing. She slipped the needle into the vein. The female jerked. A sharp twitch, then a deep exhale. Her eyelids fluttered. Not open, not conscious, but alive. Iris pulled the syringe out clean, pressed a pad to the site, and sat back with a groan, wiping her brow with a sleeve already soaked through. Royce handed her his flask without a word. She didn't drink, just held it between both hands like it gave off heat. Then came the sound again, but this time it wasn't subtle. A deliberate step, heel, then toe, on a patch of dry underbrush just beyond the fog line. Too measured for accident, too slow to be animal. Royce stiffened, his eyes flicking toward the ridge. The male rose, straightening with a grace that defied his weight. His shoulders expanded, muscles visible even beneath the soaked fur. He didn't growl, didn't move toward the noise. But his body told a story. This was protection. This was presence. Iris reached instinctively for the medical bag, pushing it behind her. Royce stood too, one boot sliding slightly in the mud before he found balance. He scanned the fog, but saw nothing. Just the shape of absence. That quiet tension that coils behind trees and waits for the wrong move. A minute passed, then another, then snap. Farther west now, closer to the ridge leading toward Maple Hollow's old mining trail. Someone was moving in a circle. Royce exhaled slowly, pulled the bolt cutters up, not as a weapon, but something to hold between himself and the cold crawl in his spine. He stepped back toward Iris. The male moved with him, one eye never leaving the darkness. "We can't stay," Royce said, his voice low. "Not here, not with her like this." Iris nodded. "You think it's them?" "I don't think it's anyone I want showing up." She looked down at the female again. The rise and fall of her chest had steadied. Still faint, but better. Royce crouched, ran a hand along her flank to check for hidden injuries. None broken, none bleeding out. Just weak, but alive. The ridge wouldn't protect them much longer. Royce stood, stared around. The hollow was too open. No cover if someone with eyes or a rifle came looking. He needed a place, a space near water, a shelter that no man had walked into in years. His mind reached back, through hunts, storms, and nights he'd rather forget. Then it landed. "There's a rock cave up near my place," he muttered. "East of the cabin. Old hunting nook I used to use when storms hit. Dry, narrow entry. Good cover." Iris didn't hesitate. "We'd need to move her now, before they get closer." Royce knelt and pulled free the coil of rope from his pack. He cut down a pair of branches thick enough to hold weight, lashed them into a makeshift sled, cross-lacing an old wool blanket between them. Iris added a layer of waterproof cloth. It wasn't perfect, but it would carry her. They moved quickly, lifting the female onto the stretcher with as much care as speed allowed. She groaned once, but didn't wake. The male followed every move with eyes that missed nothing. Royce looped the rope around his chest and pulled. The mud sucked at his boots, the grade of the slope working against him. Iris steadied the back, pressing against every root and bump to keep the sled even. The male flanked them, steps light but heavy enough to leave marks in the soil behind them. Marks that could be followed. marks they didn't have time to erase. The trail twisted past pine groves and dipped through a narrow stream, shallow but swift from the rain. The cave wasn't far, but every turn in the path felt longer with the weight dragging behind. Royce could feel it in his legs, in the burning of his lungs. But he didn't stop. Couldn't. The air behind them still felt watched. By the time they reached the outcrop, a gray wall slick with moss and age, the first light of morning had begun to bleed into the sky, pale and reluctant. Royce ducked under the stone arch, pulling the stretcher through the narrow pass. Inside, the cave opened just enough for 3 bodies and a fire. It smelled of dust and cold, but it was safe. They laid her down on a bed of pine boughs Royce pulled from the dry stash in the back wall. The male ducked in last, crouching low to avoid scraping his head, and took his place beside her, hand resting on her shoulder again. Still. Steady. Royce knelt, lit a small flame in the corner, low, soft, just enough to see by. Iris unwrapped a fresh set of gauze, checked the wound. The bleeding had slowed. Color was returning to her lips, though it was subtle. The second dose had bought time. They sat in silence then, not from exhaustion, though it pressed on them, but from the weight of what had just happened, from the thing that watched them from the trees, from the touch that still lingered on Iris's wrist, and from the knowledge that somewhere not far enough away, someone was tracking the same trail they had walked. Someone who didn't ask questions, who didn't pause when they saw pain. Outside, the wind pushed against the trees with a moan that sounded almost like mourning. But inside, the cave held stillness like breath held in prayer, and the fire whispered against the stone as if it, too, was listening. They came up over the ridge like bad weather, 3 figures cutting through the dawn with the practiced silence of men who had spent their lives listening to the woods for what they wanted to find. The light was only a smear behind the trees, pale and gray, and the hollow still held the damp breath of night. Royce saw them first in the way the birds stopped, then in the way the underbrush shifted. 3 silhouettes moving with intent, boots crushing fern and twig into wet confessions. Herman Pike led them, all broad shoulders and a face that had forgotten how to be surprised. Coat collar pulled up against the drizzle, a rifle slung low across his hip. Behind him, 2 lean men whose eyes were the kind that measured worth in what could be trapped or sold. Royce felt the old animal part of him wake. Years in the woods sharpened a man's hearing so he could tell the difference between a fox's scramble and a boot on a root. These were boots. These were the boots of men who knew how to make a quiet thing noisy. He could taste the metal of it in the air. Iris, pressed near the female beneath the tarp, counted breaths with a thumb on fur and did not look up. The cave was a small, carved-in cradle of stone. The fire in a corner breathed low and red. The male Bigfoot crouched on his haunches beside the woman, one hand resting on her shoulder with that peculiar gentleness that made Royce wonder if he'd been born of human hands as often as of forest. His chest rose and fell like wind over a field. His eyes, the color of old whiskey, watched the opening to the cave like a man watching an old wound. Herman's men did not come looking for conversation. They came for merchandise. They spoke in the rough, flat tones of men who've made a living believing the forest owes them. Herman's smile was an old thing, a way to make cruelty seem small. "Morning," Herman said, voice carrying into the damp. His 2 men fell in, scanning. "Lost something, Royce?" Royce climbed to his feet slowly. His bones felt like they had stories older than he did. He kept his hands visible. Iris rose too, shoulders squared, the needle still tucked in her belt, eyes washed hollow by the night's work. The female under the blanket shifted, a small, hopeful sound like someone remembering how to breathe. "You picked a bad morning to be a legend," Herman went on, stepping into the mouth of the cave with the ease of a man who believed the law of the land began where his boots touched dirt. Rain flecked his brim. He smelled like a bar when the jukebox is off. Cheap and dangerous. That thing's worth a good bit to the right buyer. The male rose to his feet then, slow as tide, body a silhouette of broad plains and wet fur. He stepped between Herman and the woman, palms outward as if to offer proof of intention. "Look, we mean no harm." The gesture read like old faith. Royce felt the room change. That human-like wild man face, when the fire washed over it, wasn't a mask of fury. It was a face that had learned the weather of human kindness and wanted it back. Herman laughed, a sound like dry branches. "Sentinel, huh? Like a dog guarding a backyard. It'll fetch us a price." One of Herman's men reached for a coil of wire at his belt like he was touching an old friend. The other fingered something that looked like a baited jar. Royce's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, and for a breath he could have been any man in a small town trying to keep a wrong thing from getting worse. "You get out of here," Royce said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of long winters in it. "Take your traps. Leave what you found. We don't want trouble." Herman's smile widened the way it always did when a man named Royce Tanner said he didn't want trouble. "Trouble's what puts bread on a man's table," he said, "and legend pays better than bread." Iris felt the blood drain from her face. For a second she saw the cave like an island in a gray sea, and Herman like a ship angling to cut them off. Her hands remembered stitches and splints and the kindness that should have lived in every pocket of the valley. She took one step forward. "She's hurt," she said. "She's been poisoned. If you care for anything more than your money, you'll leave." Herman's eyes flicked to where the female lay, to the heaving of her chest, and there was a glint of interest. Maybe sympathy. Maybe the cold currency of story. He shrugged like it was a curiosity he could afford. "We don't come here for charity," he said. The male made a sound then, low and guttural. It was not meant to be a threat to these men. It was a nerve signal sent to the ones he loved more than the wind. The room tilted inward with the hush that follows that kind of sound. Herman's hand drifted to his rifle. Something in the way the rifle was cradled, the way the barrel rested like a promise, forced Royce's hand to move. He reached out and squared his body in front of Iris, because he had nothing else to give, and because there was a habit in him that answered to the same old code. Protect the smaller, the weaker, the wounded. Herman's face hardened. Men like him do not enjoy being blocked by other men when they have already planned their day. "You'll put that down," Royce said. Herman's fingers tightened on the stock, and then the first shot cut the air. Sharp, immediate, a slice of cold that stung every ear. It didn't hit the ground, it hit the male. The Bigfoot's shoulder caught the round. There was no roar. There was a sound that was older. The sound of someone bearing a knife and deciding who they will be afterward. The male stumbled, one large arm bringing itself to that place where the heat of pain licked through fur and meat. He didn't shout. He did not howl. He blinked, and Royce saw a thin seam of red through his damp fur, a smear against brown like red clay on a boot. For a moment the cave hummed. The fire's light trembled against the stone. The male's face crumpled, not with animal fury, but with a human exhalation of hurt and a decision being made in the theater of his bones. Then he moved. He moved like a thing that had to move, the way a dam opens to let the river go. He lunged not at the wounded man, but for the men who had shot him, Herman and his companions. The impact of him in motion was like a tree falling in the forest. It moved the air itself. Boots skidded. Men screamed. The three hunters were suddenly very small people in a storm. The male did not tear them apart. He was not a beast of blood. He was, however, a force of desperate protection. He shoved one man into the stone wall. Another went sprawling down the shallow slope toward the cave mouth, gravel spitting up around his head like the aftermath of a bad joke. Herman, the man with the rifle, went down last, sliding with a curse into the moss. His face was a mask of surprise and then rage. He fumbled for his gun and fired again, desperation making his aim crude. Royce had seen a lot in his life. The way a truck flips, the way a boy's eye glints at real hurt. But he had never seen a creature take a bullet and keep on being something else. The male took the second shot into his side. He staggered, eyes flashing, but he did not fall. He turned, and with a motion that was almost prayer, he dragged the three men, he scooped them, into the deeper trees and shoved them into a brambled thicket like one puts a heavy bundle out of harm's way. It was rough. It was not pretty. It was necessary. In the chaos, the second man of Herman's fellers found his rifle and fired down the path, a panic-driven thing. The bullet struck a rock and chattered away, but toward where Iris and Royce moved with the female. Iris dove, grabbing the stretcher and pushing with a strength that surprised even her. Royce planted his shoulder into the sled and pulled, the mud clinging to his boots, his breath a wet burn in his chest. The male, even wounded, rose and loomed between them and the men, a battered guardian. For a sliver of time, one hand on the heart and one on the wound, he guarded them from the men who had come to cut down what they did not understand. They hooked the sled and dragged the woman toward the shelter of the cave again. In the scramble, Herman's voice reached them, high and bitter, promising things men promised to make themselves feel like winners. "You can't hide it forever, Tanner," he spat. "We'll be back. We always come back." The male's eyes met Herman's from where he stood. Royce could see blood freckling his fur. He could see the slow burn where the bullets had nicked bone and hide. He could see, too, the something that made Royce's throat sting, fear for the ones he loved, mixed with a ferocious, quiet love that would not let him step aside. Herman found his feet, crawled on hands and knees, and scrambled toward the path. The male made a noise and moved after him, not to chase, but to make sure the danger was away. Iris and Royce stumbled into the cave with the stretcher, panting like men who had been promised a bridge and found no crossing. The female's eyelids fluttered as they eased her down. The male came in last, ducking and careful, and dropped to the stone with a sound like an old door closing. He coughed once, and Royce could see blood soak a patch of fur where the second round had cut. They all watched him. For a little while, no one spoke. The fire popped, a fragile thing, and the cave smelled of wet wool and fur and something human, the musk of a house that knows love but no longer expects it in return. Iris's hands trembled as she tore fresh bandage, because men had been shot in wars and women had stitched them up, and so many other acts were the same small repetition. She worked at the wound as if she was proving to herself that hands can be trusted to repair what bullets break. Royce set his palm over the male's shoulder to steady him. The wound was not fatal, thank God, but it was honest. Blood had dampened through fur, darker than the wet dirt outside. The man in the form of the sentinel closed his eyes and pressed his head against Royce's hand with a weight that felt like apology and like trust in equal measure. "Why'd you help us?" Royce asked, not because he needed to hear the answer, but because the question is something men ask when the world rearranges itself under their feet. The male's lips, yes, lips, moved around a sound that was not a word. Iris leaned closer. Not a word, not spoken. But his eyes told them something in the universal grammar of living things. Because she is mine. Because they are mine. Because we remember. Because there is a debt older than you. They sat like that in the soft smoke and the stubborn warmth of the stone, while the light outside began its slow, indifferent climb. Far off in the trees, there was a sound like a man finding his voice and cursing into the morning. Then a truck engine somewhere, a low rumble that meant the hunters were moving, not fleeing. Herman had not given up. He did not know how to. Iris's hands kept working. Royce found bandages, wrapped, tucked, whispered nonsense about stitches and trips to town, and a doctor who might look twice at a story of wounds. The male's breathing evened but shallowly. He shifted and looked through the mouth of the cave and into the damp world where men had come with profit in their pocket and cruelty in their eyes. When they were finished, they had a curt system of exchange. Water in an old tin cup, a square of dried jerky for Royce because the world still ran on small, sensible things. A nod from Iris that said, "We do what we have to." The male turned his face to Royce and pressed something small into his palm. Mud streaked, warm from the flesh of his hand. A smudge, a mark. Dirt on skin that meant more than gratitude. Royce kept it. Outside, a wind marched through the trees like a rumor gathering strength. In the distance, the rough noise of men working a plan settled into the woods like a new threat. There would be tracks soon. There would be questions at the market and in the diner and at the post office. Stories would make their rounds. They had, for now, bought time. Time was not safety, but it was time. They had the woman and the sentinel, and a cave that tasted of pine. Royce looked at Iris and then at the male, and felt the world abrade into a new shape. There was a small, stubborn life in the hollow now that couldn't be trimmed away so easily. And somewhere down the ridge, Herman gathered himself and muttered to his men, a promise more to himself than to anyone, that he would not be walked away from this. The forest listened and only answered with the slow, indifferent fall of a single leaf, as though to remind them all that even the smallest sounds in a place like this change everything. They sat, and the fire whispered, and the wounded guardian watched the mouth of the cave like he was keeping the sky from collapsing. The work was only beginning. Under the pale weight of early morning, the cave had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles only after chaos, thick and slow like wet wool. Outside, the air smelled like scorched iron and pine smoke. Iris sat beside the wounded female Bigfoot, rewrapping the gauze with steady fingers, checking the pulse now stronger beneath her thick fur. Her chest rose with each breath, no longer a struggle, just slow recovery. Royce stood just beyond the mouth of the cave, the rifle still slung low on his back, though his hands were empty now. He wasn't watching the woods anymore. He was listening. The male hadn't returned. He'd led those men off. Herman Pike and his crew. Dragged them through the underbrush and farther into the timber where the trees grew close, and the light could barely slip between trunks. He'd done it with the kind of patience only an old guardian has, bleeding but upright, pushing deeper with each step, not in anger but in sacrifice. Royce had seen that look before, in deer that circled back toward the hound to draw it from the fawn, in the eyes of men who knew they wouldn't be coming home from the war, but still passed a letter to the next bunk. It wasn't rage. It was choice. But now it had been hours. The sun had tried to rise through the fog, but failed. A dull glow filtered through the canopy like breath behind frosted glass. Royce stepped out from the stone shelter, boots crunching across leaf rot and grit. His breath made clouds in the stillness. He reached for the strap across his shoulder, adjusted it, and started down the slope toward the red clay bend in the stream, the place where runoff gathered and left behind everything it touched. He didn't say a word to Iris. She knew. She just nodded without looking up. There were things you didn't need to explain when the woods had already done the talking for you. The trail curved wide along the ridge, past the place where a patch of elderberry thicket had been flattened in the scuffle the night before. The scent of blood still clung to the brush. Royce found it in the way the flies circled, sluggish from the cold. Then the first print, a deep, splayed impression in the mud, long as his forearm. The right foot, the toes dragged slightly, favoring the left side, still walking, still alive. He followed that trail west, deeper into the quieter parts of the forest. The woods opened into a hollow where the trees leaned, and the undergrowth thinned to bare trunks and fallen needles. There, nestled between two stumps and under the shadows of a split cedar, Royce found it, a tarp. Not a hunting blind, not a shelter, a stash, canvas dyed dark brown, tucked under brambles. Royce crouched, pulled it aside, and there they were. Steel traps, 8 of them, jawed like mouths meant to punish. Beside them, a gallon jug with a rust-colored smear at the lip. Smelled sweet and wrong, baited with poison. He knew that smell. The kind meant for coyotes or boars, but deadly to anything with blood and breath. He lifted the jug, turned it, found an old paper tag with initials burned through, HP, then a notebook, water-warped but legible. Royce flipped through pages marked with coordinates, sketches of prints, dollar signs circled in the margins. One entry dated just 2 weeks ago said, "Sighting confirmed, female plus juvenile. If both caught, double price." Royce's jaw tightened. He looked at the traps again, then toward the tree line where the print trail disappeared. For a moment, he stood still, listening, and then he made his choice. He stacked the traps first, 4 in a cross pattern, then the others on top. He poured what was left of the poisoned bait into the dirt, where it would mix with rot and vanish into the ground. Then he struck a match and touched it to the bundle of pine shavings and moss he carried in his pack. The flame caught quick. Within minutes, the fire was licking the corners of the tarp, heating the steel, curling the edge of the notebook until it shriveled. He stood there watching the smoke rise, thick and black, threading up into the sky like a signal fire from a world long buried. A warning. A reckoning. Burning someone else's gear in the middle of the woods wasn't just risky. It was criminal. There'd be trouble if it got back to town. But Royce Tanner had seen what those traps were meant for. He wasn't burning tools. He was erasing a promise of cruelty. When the smoke had darkened the sky above the ridge, he turned and kept walking. He found the mail by the stream where the earth turned red from the iron and the runoff pooled into still water. He was slumped beside the bank, one arm hanging over his lap, the other braced against a rock. Blood had dried around the bullet wound in his side, streaking down in rivulets that clung to the matted fur on his rib cage. His head was low, but when Royce stepped forward, those amber eyes opened, slow, alert, tired but aware. The human-like wild man face met his gaze without surprise. Royce didn't speak, just moved slowly, kneeling down in front of him, resting his hands on his thighs, waiting. The male didn't move. He didn't flinch when Royce reached forward, pressing 2 fingers to the edge of the wound to check for swelling. It was hot, but not fatal. The bleeding had slowed. The flesh had begun the hard work of survival. Royce leaned back on his heels. The 2 of them sat in the hush of that place. The only sound the slow burble of the creek, pulling past rocks and roots like old hands washing clean. Then, without a word, the Bigfoot reached forward. His hand, massive and rough, trembled faintly as he extended it toward Royce. Not for help, for connection. And he did something that made Royce's throat catch. He pressed his forehead against the back of Royce's hand. A single quiet gesture. Not dramatic, not desperate, just reverent. Royce didn't move for a long second. He felt the heat of the male's skin beneath the thin fur, the moisture of rain and sweat, the slow pulse of something ancient and real. A human would have said thank you. A dog might have licked his palm. This creature bowed, and in the silence of that moment, Royce understood. This wasn't about saving a life. This was about honoring it. When they rose, Royce gave him space. The male stood slowly, wincing but upright, and walked back toward the trail with the kind of slow dignity only a hurt body could carry. Royce followed behind, not leading, not pushing, just there. When they passed under the curve of the pines and climbed the narrow path back toward the cave, the wind had shifted. The smell of fire still clung to their clothes. By the time they reached the entrance, twilight had begun to settle. The forest dimmed into that purple hush that only lasts 20 minutes. Long enough to know you're between worlds, not quite night, no longer day. Iris saw them first. She was still at the fire, mixing something into a tin cup. When she turned and saw the male behind Royce, something in her posture gave. Not collapsed, not broken, just softened. She stood and moved toward them without asking questions. She knelt, checked the wound again. He let her. She cleaned it this time with warm water and wrapped it fresh. He didn't look at her hands. He looked at her face, as if watching the work she did was how he measured safety. When it was done, he leaned his head against the stone wall, exhaled once, and closed his eyes. Royce stepped outside the cave and looked back at the woods. The smoke had drifted. The sky had cleared. And far off, too far to be seen, but close enough to be felt, the sound of a truck engine passed low on the horizon. Maybe Herman and his boys had gone home to stew in whatever stories they'd come up with. Maybe they were planning something worse. But for now, they were gone. And inside that cave, a wounded sentinel was breathing easier. The woman he'd fought for slept on her side, her hand now resting against her mate's chest, like a memory that knew its way home. Royce rubbed the back of his own hand absently. A faint stain of red clay still clung to the skin. Not blood, not dirt from the stream. A single patch where the male's brow had rested. He didn't wipe it off. He let it dry, let it stay. Because some marks weren't meant to be cleaned, they were meant to be carried. And somewhere beyond the trees, the forest exhaled in a hush of wind, as if approving. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like old things watching and nodding in their own quiet way. It was not over, but it was something. A line drawn, a bond made, and the sky, turning deep and blue, held it all without saying a word. Under a sky bruised by late winter light, the ridge above Maple Hollow sat tense and quiet, the way old wood groans before it splits. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air carried that heavy stillness that made birds go silent and made the lungs tighten without knowing why. Down near the chapel, the bell rope swayed gently in the breeze, though no one had pulled it. It creaked against the wood beam like a whisper waiting to be remembered. The old bridge, narrow and nailed together back when trucks were lighter and folks trusted timber more than concrete, stood over the shallow bend of Crooked Fork Creek. That's where Royce and Iris came through, slow, deliberate, with the wounded male between them. His breath thick, labored, but steady. He didn't lean on them. He walked on his own, one step at a time, his massive frame hunched slightly forward from pain or caution, maybe both. His human-like wild man face was pale around the mouth, fur damp and clumped from dried blood and creek mist. Amber eyes dulled by fatigue, but watching, always watching. Royce's coat flapped in the wind. Iris held a cloth bag tight to her side, the edges stained with field dressings and vials, and the quiet burden of responsibility. They were just feet from the bridge when Herman Pike stepped out from the tree line like he'd been grown there by the cold. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just raised the shotgun to shoulder height and drew a slow breath through his nose, as if smelling the air would give him the courage to do what he thought needed doing. His coat was the same waxed canvas Royce remembered from younger days, dark green and faded at the collar, spotted with pine pitch and mule sweat. His boots were caked in red dirt and something darker. His eyes were steel gray. Sharp in that way only desperation makes a man. But it wasn't the gun that made Royce freeze. It was where it pointed, dead center on Iris. She didn't flinch. Her boots stuck to the old bridge planks, her back straight, face unreadable. She'd seen enough of this kind of stare in vet clinics when a man asked if the dog should be put down or stitched up. Behind her, the male stopped. The wind moved his hair across his cheek like threads of shadow. He stepped forward, not fast, not sudden, but with the weight of something that had been building since that first knock on Royce's door. His shoulders widened with the movement. His arms lifted slowly, palms out, as if to hold the air between himself and the shotgun. And for a moment, time stopped moving. There was no wind, no bird call, Only the sound of water beneath the bridge and the creak of wood beneath worn boots. The male placed himself between Herman and the humans without force, just presence. His arms extended just slightly, wide enough to shelter without smothering. And when his eyes met Herman's, they didn't burn. They mourned. There was no roar, no threat, just a gaze filled with tired dignity and something far more dangerous: mercy. The gun didn't lower. Herman's jaw twitched. You think it matters what it feels? You think that thing understands right from wrong? Royce stepped beside Iris, hand half raised like he was calming a spooked horse. Put the gun down, Herman. You pull that trigger, and no one's gonna believe it was about protection. Herman's eyes flicked to Royce, then back to the male, as if trying to convince himself this wasn't what it looked like. A creature shielding others, not attacking. Something in his stance cracked. Maybe it was the way the male stood so still, so unwavering. Maybe it was the blood on his side and the memory of how he'd taken 2 rounds and kept walking. Maybe it was because, deep down, Herman Pike knew this wasn't a monster. It was a witness. But just as his fingers started to loosen on the trigger, the sound came. Not from the bridge. From the chapel below. A single note. Then 2. The bell rope had been pulled. Royce's head turned. Down in the hollow, at the edge of the chapel stairs, old Ned Hamilton, the blacksmith who still kept iron tools under his workbench and stories older than most maps, was pulling the rope with both hands, each tug slow, deliberate. The bell pealed out across the hollow, low and echoing, calling no sermon, only memory. Its voice curled into the wind, reached through trees, slid over rooftops and fences and cattle gates. 1 ring, 2, 3. More than sound. It was summoning. Windows opened in the houses below. A door creaked at Millie Durant's old store. Footsteps on porches. People stepping out. Not with phones or flashlights, but with quiet eyes and coats still damp from sleep. Word had already gotten out, like it always did in small towns before anyone spoke it aloud. They'd seen the fire on the ridge, heard the shots in the trees. They'd seen the way Royce walked differently these days. And now they saw it for themselves. At the top of the bridge, Herman Pike stood with his gun halfway raised and a town watching. More footsteps. The postmaster, 2 boys from the feed store, a woman clutching a Bible to her chest but looking like she might throw it if she had to. Herman's hands trembled. The bell kept tolling. The male didn't move. He stood like stone carved into the shape of trust. The kind of trust that only shows up when it costs you something. Royce stepped forward again, slow, 1 foot on the edge of the boards. Put it down, Herman, he said again. Softer now. You're not just facing him anymore. Herman looked past them, finally saw what the ringing had done. People didn't have cameras. They didn't hold up phones. They held memory. Faces wide with shock, yes, but also something else. Witness. The gun lowered an inch, then another, and that's when Royce moved. Quick, certain, like he'd been waiting for that shift. He lunged, caught the barrel with both hands. Herman cursed, yanked, but Royce twisted the stock sideways, pulled him down with the force of a tree limb snapping. They both hit the bridge hard, wood rattling beneath their weight. The gun clattered and slid across the planks. Iris was already moving. She grabbed it and stepped back, holding it in both hands like she'd been trained for this all her life. Herman scrambled up, tried to reach for the side of his belt, but found nothing. Royce held his wrist tight, twisted it behind his back, and spun the man toward the guardrail. In one breathless motion, he pulled the coil of snare wire from Herman's own belt loop and wrapped it around both wrists. Fast, tight. The kind of tie you didn't come out of unless someone meant to let you out. The whole bridge had gone quiet. No applause, no shouting, just the wind moving through pine needles and a bell that had finally gone still. Herman didn't say a word. He sat on the bridge, breathing hard, wrists bound in his own trap line, eyes flicking back and forth like a man searching for the version of the story where he came out clean. But no one was buying. Because in that silence, what stood out most wasn't the blood or the rifle or the old grudges. It was the shape of the one who hadn't run. The male Bigfoot. Standing tall in front of two humans. No rage, no wildness. Just the exhausted grace of someone who didn't know how to be cruel, even when given every reason. Ned let go of the rope. The chapel bell swayed once, then went still. Royce looked down the slope at all the faces watching. Some mouths open, others shaking. But not in fear, not anymore. In knowing. And that knowing settled deep, somewhere no story could undo. Royce hauled Herman to his feet, guided him roughly to the edge of the bridge where the sheriff's deputy was already parking at the end of the gravel path. Siren never needed. Iris stepped back to the male, checking his wound again. He didn't stop her. His breath was slow, heavy, but safe. For now. They didn't speak as the crowd slowly dispersed. Some turned away without a word. Some nodded, mostly at Royce or Iris, but not a few at the figure still standing under the tree line. His face half in light, half in mist. The human-like wild man face of a being who had risked everything not to fight, but to shield. Royce looked at the gun in Iris's hands and took it from her gently. They both watched the sun finally climb over the ridge, painting Maple Hollow in gold and shadow. Somewhere behind them, the creek whispered against the rocks. Somewhere deeper, the woods listened, and no one pulled the bell again, because it had already said enough. And the forest, as always, remembered. Spring came late to the ridges above Maple Hollow, as if the mountains had made a quiet agreement with the cold to hold on a little longer. But when it came, it didn't ask permission. It came in the sound of water rushing fuller through the red clay creeks, in the way the frost finally cracked off the rocks like old armor, and in the way the pine pollen floated like gold mist just above the forest floor. By the second week of March, the trees were pulsing with a kind of breath you could feel through your boots. Life was coming back. Slowly, like something testing if it was safe to grow again. Inside the stone cave, light fell through the narrow mouth in stripes, landing across the wool blanket Iris had tucked around the female Bigfoot's legs. She'd unwrapped the bandages that morning, checking the wound carefully. The infection was gone. The skin had begun to harden and pink beneath the fur. The pulse was steady, not labored anymore. The creature's breath came deep, silent. The kind of rest that doesn't come from sleep alone, but from surviving something you weren't sure you would. Iris sat cross-legged by the fire, stirring water in a tin cup with a willow twig. Her fingers still smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine sap. She hadn't said much that morning. She hadn't needed to. Royce had already walked down to check the traps he'd reset farther east. Not to catch, just to track movement. And the male had gone with him, limping less with each day, still guarding, always watching, but no longer made of tension. He walked beside Royce now, not behind. By noon, Royce was back. He pushed aside the canvas flap they'd strung over the cave's mouth and stepped inside with boots scuffed in red dirt and a fresh nick across his knuckle from a thorn vine. "She's good," Iris said, glancing up. "Held weight on both legs this morning. Didn't collapse." Royce grunted, dropped the satchel beside the wall, and crouched near the fire. "She looked at you yet?" Iris shook her head. "Almost, but not quite. He has. She just keeps her eyes low, like she's waiting to see how this ends." Royce didn't answer. He stirred the fire absently with a piece of bark, then looked toward the back of the cave where the female lay. The male had returned now, standing just behind Royce, silent. He stepped forward, crouched beside her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Not pressing, just grounding. She stirred, then slowly opened her eyes. This time she didn't turn away. She looked up at him first, then past him, to Royce, to Iris. Her amber eyes didn't widen, didn't flash, just held them for a breath longer than before. And that was enough. That afternoon, Royce rode into town for the first time in days. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. The court date was set. Herman Pike was being charged with illegal trapping, animal cruelty, intent to traffic wildlife, and carrying an unregistered weapon on state land. It wasn't enough to jail a man forever, but it was enough to stop him for a while, and enough to make people talk. Royce parked near the courthouse, sat with his hat low as Iris walked inside to testify. He didn't need to speak. Iris had brought samples, photos of the baits, steel traps, the vet logs she'd kept since the day they treated the wounds. The judge barely looked up when Iris handed over the notebook with Herman's scribbled coordinates and sketches. It was all there. Enough truth to weigh the room. They didn't ask who the patient was, didn't dare. People in town didn't press much. That's the thing about places like Maple Hollow. They see what they see, and they decide in silence what to believe. Most didn't ask questions. Some left jars of salve on Royce's porch. Some dropped extra firewood at the Bell House without a note. Old Ned, the blacksmith, stood outside the post office and nodded once when Royce passed. Nothing more. By the time they got back up the mountain, the wind had shifted. Snowmelt ran in thin rivulets down the old footpaths. The stone circle behind Royce's cabin, the one he hadn't touched in years, was glinting with moss and memory. He passed it without looking. The next morning the female stood. It was just after sunrise. The sky was pink and split by crow calls. The fire had burned low. Royce was outside collecting water. Iris was packing the medical kit. The male was resting near the mouth of the cave, his eyes half closed. When she rose, no one saw it, but they felt it. Her weight shifted against the earth like an old bell being rung from deep underground. Royce turned first, then Iris, then the male. She was tall, not just in height, but in presence. Her fur was darker than the male's, with streaks of gray down her sides like weathered bark. Her face, unmistakably human-like, still carried fatigue, but the pain was gone. Her amber eyes scanned the space, calm. Then she turned. Her hand reached out, slow, steady, and found his. Not clenched, not clinging, just rested there. Iris stepped forward without thinking. She crouched, unwrapped the final bandage around the ankle, and held it in her palm a second longer than needed. Then she looked up at the creature and said, quietly, "You're okay now." The female blinked, and for the first time, a sound rose in her chest. Not a cry, not a growl. Just a low, warm breath that sounded like something loosening. Iris sat back and wiped her face with the back of her wrist before the tears made it down. Later that day, the deputy came up the ridge to collect final evidence. He asked no questions. He just took the paperwork, took the photos, thanked Royce and Iris, then left. By dusk, the wind shifted again. It brought with it a silence that felt like permission. Royce sat alone on the front porch, sipping coffee gone cold, watching the edge of the woods. The cabin lights were dimmed. The old radio was off. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but the ache in his bones told him he'd drifted. When he woke, the first thing he noticed was the absence of sound. The second was the presence just beyond the porch. He didn't move. He looked through the darkness toward the tree line, where the faintest movement stirred behind the cedars. The male stood there, upright, still, watching. His human-like wild man face was calm, not hidden, not crouching. Just there, behind him, the female. They didn't step forward. They just stood in the halo of moonlight, watching the yellow glow from Royce's window. Then, after a pause so long it felt sacred, they turned, together, walked back into the trees. No rustle, no break, just the hush of two lives returning to a world deeper than any human path. Royce sat for a while after that. He didn't reach for his coat, Didn't call Iris. Just stared at the line where forest met clearing and felt the weight of something being returned, not taken. Before he turned in, he ran his fingers along the back of his hand. The smear of red clay was long gone, but he still felt it. The next morning, just after first light, he opened the door to find the porch empty, except for a small curl of bark set square in the middle of the top step. Wrapped in a strand of dried grass, nothing carved, nothing written, just left. He picked it up, set it on the shelf beside the coffee tin and the pair of deer antlers his daughter had found years ago. Didn't say a word. Because some debts weren't spoken, they were kept. And as the creek rushed louder that morning and the pine tips waved like slow hands in the wind, the land exhaled. Not loud, not proud, just full, whole, present. The forest had seen, and the forest had chosen. But even then, Royce knew this wasn't an ending. Not really. It rained that morning. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a soft, persistent drizzle. The kind that turned the red clay by the stream into something slick and alive. The surface of the water barely rippled, each drop threading itself into the current like silver thread in a dark cloth. Royce stood at the kitchen window, the same cracked one his wife had taped once, years back, when a branch knocked through during a storm. He didn't bother to wipe the fog from the glass. He just stared through it, holding the old tin coffee pot in one hand and watching the rain touch the porch like it meant something. On the top step, nestled right in the middle like someone had measured the spot with care, was a single river stone. Not large, not carved, smooth, round, and wrapped in the faintest smear of dried red clay. Royce didn't need to open the door to know it hadn't been there yesterday. He stood still for a long while, the warmth from the stove crawling up his spine, coffee going cold in the pot. No tracks, no sound. Just the soft hush of a promise laid down without a word. He opened the door slow, as if not to startle whatever air still lingered from their leaving. Bent down, picked up the stone, held it in his hand a second longer than he needed to, feeling the weight of it, not just in ounces, but in what it stood for. No ribbon, no mark, but it carried more than memory. It carried agreement. A quiet kind. He set it inside, up on the shelf above the hearth, right beside the ball of yarn his mother had never finished knitting before her hands forgot how. Right where it could stay. That same day, just before noon, Royce and Iris walked the border of the property where the trees grew thick and the fence had long since sagged inward. She carried a small canvas sack. He held a coil of rope he didn't need, just out of habit. They didn't say much. Halfway down the ridge, where the old deer path curved into a field of moss and leaf rot, they saw the two figures waiting. Not hiding, not lurking. Just there, like they belonged. And they did. The male stood taller now. The way his shoulders had pulled back told Royce the pain was gone. The female stepped forward, just half a stride, as if to show this meeting wasn't a mistake. No words, just presence. The human-like wild man faces of both were calm, almost softened in the way warm stone feels when it's been in the sun too long. Their amber eyes held Royce and Iris, not like animals sizing up prey or people scanning danger. Just acknowledgement. Iris stepped forward first. She didn't carry a gift. She didn't kneel. She just stood tall, eyes wet but voice steady. "I'm glad you made it," she said, though she knew they wouldn't answer in the way people did. The female blinked, then did something so small it would have been missed by anyone not watching. She bowed her head, just once, and the male followed. Both of them held it there, for a breath, a beat, a moment that carried all the weight of survival and sorrow and forgiveness and gratitude wrapped into something too old for English. And then they turned. The trees swallowed them slow, not like a secret being kept, but like a memory being returned to where it came from. Royce watched until the last glimpse of fur disappeared between two cedar trunks. The air stayed still, and somehow, that stillness felt full. In the weeks that followed, The valley didn't speak much of what had happened. Maple Hollow went on the way it always had, though something under its skin had shifted. No one came to collect the traps Herman left behind. No one asked why the postmaster stopped hunting for a month. No one questioned why Millie Durant left out bowls of fresh apples at the back door, even though she lived alone. But something changed, and one afternoon, 3 weeks to the day since Royce found the stone on his porch, the deer came back. A small group at first. Does. Young ones. Then a buck with a cracked tine and a strange gentleness in the way he walked. They moved through the trees like ghosts, but slower, braver. Royce watched them from the porch, same tin mug in hand, steam curling through the late morning air like memory. He didn't speak, didn't whistle, just watched. Because sometimes the forest answers in things that don't speak at all, and it was enough. On a Sunday, not long after, Iris came by with a pie she hadn't meant to make. They sat on the porch, shared coffee in silence, watched the wind move through the early leaves like it was checking for permission. At one point, Royce nodded toward the shelf inside. "You seen the stone?" he asked. Iris smiled. "I figured they'd leave something." Royce looked out toward the woods again. "It wasn't a goodbye." "No," she said. "It wasn't." And they didn't say more. Because some debts aren't meant to be spoken. They just rest in the bones of people who lived through something bigger than themselves. People who didn't turn away when it got hard. People who made space for a kind of miracle that didn't come with wings or flashlights or television crews. Just tracks in the mud. Hands that didn't tremble. Eyes that saw past fear. Somewhere deeper in the woods, beyond where the map lines draw fences and trails, a pair of lives moved together through shadow and light. The male's shoulder had healed into a thick ridge of fur. The female walked strong now, step for step beside him. They didn't speak in the way we do, but every once in a while, he'd reach out, touch her wrist, and she'd slow her breath like someone remembering the shape of safety. Back in town, no one built a monument, no plaque, no carved wood sign beside the trail. But people remembered, and remembering in a place like Maple Hollow is sometimes all the truth you need. Royce kept the porch light on most nights. Not bright, just enough to say, "You're not alone out there." And sometimes, when the creek ran high or the wind shifted just so, he'd sit up in bed, feel the hush at the edge of the woods, and know something was watching. Not in fear, not in warning, in gratitude. Because once, in the cold season, a knock had come not on the door, but on the soul. And instead of turning away, he'd answered. And the forest never forgets that kind of thing. Never. Even if it doesn't leave footprints behind. Even if it never knocks again. Even if it only returns in the form of a single, silent stone. It remembers, and it waits. And it carries those who choose kindness in the quiet. Always. Sometimes, the most powerful stories don't end with applause or answers. They settle into the quiet places of our hearts, like the hush of a forest after rain, or the silence between two souls who understand each other without saying a word. These are the stories that don't shout. They don't ask to be remembered. They simply stay, waiting gently for us to return to them when we're ready. Because somewhere deep in all of us is a knowing that kindness, once given, does not disappear. It echoes. It ripples. It plants itself like a seed in places we don't even realize are dry. And one day, when we least expect it, it grows back toward us in the form of grace. Maybe not loudly, maybe not quickly, but always with meaning. The truth is, we may never fully understand what walks beside us in this world. Whether in the trees or in the spaces between our ordinary days, there are things we can't explain. Only feel. But we do know this. Compassion is a language older than words. And when we choose to act from it, without needing to be seen, without expecting anything in return, we take part in something sacred, something real. Sometimes it takes courage to help a stranger. Sometimes it takes more to help a being we don't even understand. But time and again, it is those small, quiet acts the ones no one else sees, that end up making the biggest difference. They are the reason trust can bloom again in broken places. The reason something wild and wounded might come close, not to hurt, but to hope. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. To show up for something fragile, to hold space for something sacred, even when the world tells us to look away. To believe in our bones that empathy is not weakness, it's wisdom. That gentleness is not foolishness, it's strength. We live in a time where noise often drowns out meaning, where fear runs faster than understanding. But every so often, a story reminds us who we are when we're at our best. Not perfect, not fearless, just present, willing, still capable of choosing love over doubt. So if this story moves something in you, even quietly, hold on to that. Let it remind you that healing is possible, that grace can be found in unexpected places, and that the things we do for one another, no matter how small, are never lost. They live on in ways we might never fully see. Thank you for spending time with this journey. If it stirred your heart, even just a little, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. And if you'd like to join us for more stories like this, filled with wonder, emotion, and a little bit of mystery, please consider subscribing and following along. Until next time, take care of each other, and stay open to the things that still choose kindness in a quiet world.